My name is Henry. I'm 36 years old, and for the last decade, I've worked in corporate compliance for a mid-sized technology firm in Seattle. If you met me at the office, you probably wouldn't remember much about me. I'm not the loud one in meetings. I'm not the person who argues to be heard, and I'm definitely not the guy who dominates a room. Most people describe me with the same few words: quiet, dependable, easygoing. The kind of coworker who takes notes. The kind who stays late to double-check reports. The one managers rely on when something needs to be done correctly the first time. It's a reputation I never really fought against. In fact, for most of my career, I leaned into it. Being underestimated has a strange advantage. When people assume you're harmless, they stop paying attention to you. They speak more freely. They make decisions without worrying about how they look. And sometimes, they make mistakes in front of you. The story I'm about to tell you started at what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon meeting. A small conference room, 6 coworkers around the table, a routine project discussion, nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. But halfway through that meeting, something happened that would quietly change the next 6 months of my professional life. One of my coworkers stood up, walked out of the room, and within an hour filed a complaint with HR. The accusation? He told them I had been harassing him. Now, if you've ever worked in a corporate environment, you know how serious a statement like that can be. These kinds of allegations don't just stay on paper. They affect careers, reputations, and sometimes entire teams. He filed the complaint confidently, assuming it was my word against his. Unfortunately for him, the meeting room had automatic recording enabled. What followed wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't revenge. And it certainly wasn't the kind of dramatic office confrontation people imagine. Instead, it became a slow, quiet unraveling of assumptions about who I was, about what had really been happening in that office, and about how dangerous it can be to misunderstand someone who prefers to stay silent. This story isn't about winning. It's about clarity, about the difference between being quiet and being powerless, and about what happens when someone finally realizes the two aren't the same thing. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where people completely misunderstood who you were, simply because you didn't feel the need to prove it? If you asked anyone in the office to describe me back then, most of them would probably pause for a moment before answering, not because they disliked me, but because I simply wasn't someone people spent much time thinking about. In every workplace, there are a few categories of people everyone notices. The ambitious ones, who constantly speak in meetings. The charismatic personalities, who seem to float from desk to desk, collecting conversations. And the natural leaders, who somehow end up in charge of things, whether they asked for it or not. I didn't belong to any of those groups. I was the quiet one in the room, the person who listened more than he spoke, the coworker who took notes during meetings, while others debated ideas that would eventually become my responsibility to document correctly. My role was compliance, which, if you're not familiar with corporate structures, essentially means being the person who notices problems before they become disasters. Policies, documentation, regulatory requirements, internal audits. It's the kind of job that only gets attention when something goes wrong. When things run smoothly, people rarely think about it at all. And that suited me just fine. I wasn't trying to stand out. I wasn't trying to climb the ladder faster than anyone else. I liked the quiet predictability of my work. There was something satisfying about making systems cleaner and more reliable, even if no one ever noticed. Over time, that reputation settled into place. Henry is dependable. Henry is calm. Henry doesn't cause problems. If someone forgot to prepare documentation before a deadline, I would quietly help fix it. If a meeting ran long and someone needed the notes organized afterward, I'd already have them ready. If a manager needed a policy explained before presenting to executives, they usually stopped by my desk. I became the person people relied on when accuracy mattered. But there's a strange side effect to being reliable in that way. People start assuming you'll always absorb inconvenience without complaint. They assume you'll stay quiet when someone interrupts you. They assume you won't challenge small dismissals. Not out of cruelty, mostly just habit. When someone has never seen you push back, they begin to believe you simply won't. So over the years, a certain version of me formed in their minds, a harmless version. The quiet guy who writes things down, the coworker who nods politely in meetings, the one who doesn't argue. What most people didn't realize was that my silence was never about uncertainty. It was about observation. I've always had the kind of memory that stores small details automatically. Not just what people say, but when they say it. The tone they use. The way decisions actually happen versus the way they're described later. And when you spend enough time quietly documenting things for a living, patterns start to reveal themselves. Who takes credit for ideas? Who avoids responsibility when projects fail? Who changes their story depending on who's listening? Again, I wasn't looking for these patterns. They simply appeared over time, like fingerprints slowly forming on glass. Still, none of that felt particularly important back then. Work was stable, the team functioned well enough, and most days ended the same way they began, quietly. Which is why the first real shift in this story didn't feel dramatic at all. It was just a small moment in a meeting. A sentence someone said casually, a comment everyone else ignored, except me. And sometimes, the smallest things end up being the ones that change everything. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. If you had been sitting in that meeting room, you probably wouldn't have remembered it by the end of the day. It was a Wednesday morning project sync. Nothing unusual. 6 of us around the table, laptops open, coffee cups scattered across the polished surface. The glass walls made the room feel bright, even though the Seattle sky outside was its usual soft gray. Meetings like that followed a predictable rhythm. A project manager would walk through updates. Someone would raise a concern about deadlines. A few people would debate priorities for a few minutes, and eventually we would all agree on the next steps. My role in those meetings was simple. Listen, document decisions, clarify compliance details if they came up. Most of the time, I spoke only when someone asked. That morning, the conversation shifted toward a feature rollout that had been delayed twice already. There were questions about whether the documentation requirements had been completed correctly. Someone turned toward me. "Henry, do we have the compliance checklist finalized yet?" I opened my notebook, flipped to the page I'd prepared the night before, and started explaining the status. It was straightforward. A couple of items still need sign-off, but nothing that would delay the release if we addressed them that week. Halfway through my explanation, someone across the table sighed. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. I looked up. Mark Ellison was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, the faintest smile on his face. Mark had joined the company about 8 months earlier. Product strategy. Confident, articulate, the kind of person who could command attention without raising his voice. People liked him. He had a quick wit, and he was good at presenting ideas in a way that sounded both bold and practical at the same time. But in that moment, he waved a hand lightly in my direction. "Henry," he said, with a half laugh, "we don't need the entire compliance lecture right now." A couple of people at the table chuckled politely, not cruelly, just the kind of soft laughter people offer when someone charismatic makes a joke. Mark continued. "We're just trying to move the project forward. Let's not slow things down with too many technical details." The room shifted subtly. No one looked at me directly anymore. A few eyes dropped back to laptops. Someone started discussing timeline adjustments as if the conversation had simply moved on. And technically, it had. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Tasks were assigned. Deadlines were mentioned. Everyone eventually gathered their laptops and headed back to their desks. No one apologized. No one even acknowledged what had happened. Because to everyone else, nothing had happened. Just a small joke. A harmless interruption. But something about the way Mark had said it stayed with me, not the words themselves. The confidence behind them. The assumption that my contribution was something unnecessary. Something that could be dismissed with a quick laugh and a wave of the hand. And more interestingly, the way the room had accepted that interpretation instantly. No resistance, no hesitation, just a quiet agreement. That moment lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it told me something important about how people in that room saw me. Not as someone whose input mattered, just someone who handled paperwork after the real decisions were made. At the time, I didn't react. I simply closed my notebook, listened to the rest of the meeting, and finished documenting the action items afterward. But that was the first small shift. The first time I noticed that silence, in certain environments, can be interpreted as permission. Permission to interrupt. Permission to dismiss. Permission to rewrite someone's role in the room. And once that permission appears, people tend to use it again. After that meeting, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no tension in the hallway, no awkward conversations afterward. In fact, if you had asked anyone in the office the next day, Whether anything unusual had occurred, they probably would have said no. Mark stopped by desks, chatting the way he usually did. People laughed at his comments during stand-up meetings. Work continued moving forward, and I continued doing my job. That's the interesting thing about small moments of dismissal. They rarely arrive as obvious conflicts. Instead, they slip quietly into the background, blending into everyday behavior until they start to feel normal. Over the next few weeks, I noticed the pattern repeating in subtle ways. It wasn't always Mark. Sometimes it was just the rhythm of conversation shifting slightly whenever I spoke. I'd begin explaining a regulatory requirement, and someone would jump in halfway through with a different topic. Or a manager would say, "Let's circle back to compliance later," and the meeting would move on. Again, none of it felt openly hostile. No one was insulting me. No one was raising their voice. But slowly, the unspoken rule became clear. My input belonged at the edges of the conversation, not the center. Mark, however, seemed especially comfortable reinforcing that pattern. One afternoon during a product planning session, I started outlining a documentation risk related to a new feature rollout. It was a fairly technical explanation, the kind that sounds slow compared to the faster pace of strategy discussions. About 30 seconds into it, Mark leaned forward with a grin. "Henry's about to give us the extended director's cut again," he said lightly. A few people smiled. One of the engineers laughed and said, "Let's keep it short, Henry. We've got another meeting in 15. I shortened the explanation, 2 sentences instead of the full context. Technically, the information was still accurate, but without the details, the risk sounded smaller than it actually was. The team moved on. Later that week, I noticed something else. During a presentation Mark gave to leadership, he referenced a compliance checkpoint related to the same project. The phrasing sounded familiar, not identical to what I had said in the meeting, but close enough that I recognized the underlying idea. The executives nodded. Someone complimented the thoroughness of the planning. Mark accepted the praise easily. Again, I didn't interrupt. Not because I felt intimidated, but because I understood something most people overlook about workplace dynamics. When a pattern begins forming, reacting emotionally to the early stages rarely changes it. It usually just reinforces the story people already believe. And the story they believed about me was simple. Henry doesn't mind. Henry is easygoing. Henry will adjust. So I did adjust, but not in the way they expected. Externally, nothing about my behavior changed. I still attended meetings, still took notes, still answered questions calmly when someone asked. Internally, however, I started paying closer attention, not just to what people said, but how information moved through the room, who interrupted whom, who repeated ideas in different wording later, who received credit when decisions were summarized. These details were already part of how my brain worked. Compliance requires that kind of observation, but now, those observations began forming a clearer picture, not one person behaving badly, but of a system, a subtle hierarchy inside conversations, where some voices automatically carried authority, and others were treated as background noise. And once that hierarchy settles into place, people stop noticing it altogether, which meant something important had already happened without anyone realizing it. A role had been assigned to me, quiet, supportive, invisible when necessary, and the more everyone accepted that role, the easier it became to overlook what I was actually paying attention to. By the time the pattern had repeated a few more times, the role I occupied in the office had quietly solidified. Not officially. No one ever said it out loud, but in workplaces, roles often exist long before anyone acknowledges them. You see them in small things: who gets interrupted, who people look at when decisions are made, who gets asked to explain something, and who gets asked to approve it. Some people are treated as drivers of conversation. Others are treated as support. And somewhere along the way, I had been placed firmly in the second category, the reliable one, the note-taker, the person who would fill in the gaps after the real discussion had already happened. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. My job wasn't about visibility. Compliance rarely is. If systems worked correctly, and the company stayed protected from regulatory mistakes, I considered that success. Recognition was never part of the equation. But the more I observed meetings, the more I realized something subtle had shifted. It wasn't just that my voice carried less weight. It was that people had started anticipating my silence. If I raised a concern, someone would reassure the room that it was just a procedural thing. And if I began explaining a requirement, someone would summarize it quickly, often oversimplifying it, before I could finish. The conversation would move forward as if the full explanation had never existed. And gradually, the room learned something about me. Henry won't push back. Henry won't challenge the interpretation. Henry will simply adjust. The strange thing is, they weren't entirely wrong. I didn't push back. But not because I felt powerless. Because pushing back in those moments wouldn't change the structure of the room. Once a group collectively assigns someone a role, challenging that role publicly often reinforces it. If the quiet person suddenly argues, the room doesn't usually rethink its assumptions. Instead, they interpret the reaction as unusual behavior. Why is Henry suddenly being defensive? So I let the role remain, reliable, supportive, quiet. There was a certain freedom in that position. Actually, when people assume you're not competing for attention, they stop measuring their words around you. They speak casually. They admit things without realizing it. They explain their reasoning openly without worrying how it might sound. Mark, especially, seemed comfortable in that environment. His confidence in meetings grew stronger over time. He spoke quickly, easily guiding conversations toward the outcomes he preferred. Sometimes he referenced things I had mentioned previously. Other times, he framed ideas as if they had emerged spontaneously during discussion. No one questioned it. That's not unusual in workplaces. Ideas evolve all the time, collectively. Credit becomes blurry. But the interesting part wasn't the credit. It was the assumption behind it. Mark spoke as though the room naturally belonged to him. And in a way, it did. People listened when he spoke. They laughed at his jokes. They accepted his summaries as accurate representations of what had just been discussed. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything: meeting notes, policy clarifications, action items. That small black notebook stayed with me everywhere, not because I expected conflict, but because years earlier, I had learned something important about professional environments. Memory is unreliable. Documentation isn't. At the time, that habit felt routine. Just part of doing my job carefully. I had no idea that those quiet records, those ordinary meeting details, were slowly becoming something else entirely, something that would matter much more than anyone in that room realized, including Mark. The shift didn't happen during a conflict. There was no dramatic meeting, no confrontation in the hallway, no moment where someone said something so outrageous that the room fell silent. Instead, it happened on a quiet afternoon that felt almost forgettable. It was late October, the kind of gray Seattle day where the sky looks the same from morning until evening. Most of the office had already settled into that midweek rhythm. Headphones on, keyboards clicking, occasional conversations drifting across the open workspace. I had just finished reviewing a set of compliance updates for a project Mark's team was leading. Nothing unusual there. I had reviewed dozens of similar documents over the years. But as I compared the latest project notes with earlier meeting summaries, I noticed something small, a detail that didn't quite align. One of the risk checkpoints, the same one I had tried to explain in that earlier meeting, had been removed from the documentation, not reworded, removed entirely. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. Documents get edited constantly in collaborative systems, and sometimes sections disappear accidentally during revisions, so I opened the version history. That's when I saw the edit. The change had been intentional. Someone had deleted the entire section and added a short comment in the margin, explaining the reason. Unnecessary compliance complexity slows rollout. The author of the edit was Mark. Again, none of this was dramatic. People simplify documentation all the time when they're trying to move projects forward, but the comment caught my attention for a different reason. Because the risk checkpoint he had removed wasn't just a suggestion, it was tied to a regulatory requirement, meaning the company technically needed that verification step documented before release. Without it, the project could still move forward, but if anyone ever audited the process later, the gap would be obvious. I sat there for a moment, reading the comment again. Unnecessary compliance complexity. It wasn't the first time someone had treated a compliance detail like an inconvenience. But something about seeing it written so plainly shifted the way I thought about the pattern that had been forming. Until then, most of the moments I had noticed were social ones. Interruptions in meetings, casual jokes. Ideas are being reshaped during discussions. None of those things had real consequences. They were just part of workplace dynamics. But documentation was different. Documentation created a record, and records mattered. Quietly, I restored the deleted section in the draft and added a short note explaining why the checkpoint existed. Not confrontational, just a clarification referencing the regulation it addressed. Then I closed the document and went back to reviewing the rest of the file. From the outside, nothing about that moment looked important. Just another routine compliance edit. But internally, something had shifted in the way I viewed the situation. Up until that point, I had mostly been observing patterns, watching how conversations flowed, noticing how roles formed inside the team. Now, for the first time, I realized something else. The same assumptions that made people comfortable dismissing my voice in meetings were also shaping the decisions they made afterward. They assumed compliance details were flexible. They assumed someone like me would quietly adjust things behind the scenes. They assumed those details didn't truly affect them. And perhaps most importantly, they assumed no one was paying very close attention. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made things clearer. Because when people underestimate the role of documentation in an organization, they create a very specific kind of vulnerability. One that usually stays invisible right up until the moment it matters most. That afternoon, I closed my laptop, picked up my notebook, and wrote down the date. Just a small habit, a record of when something first became clear. Not because I expected trouble, but because sometimes, the moment things start shifting is easier to recognize afterward. And I had a quiet feeling that this was one of those moments. After that afternoon, nothing changed on the surface. The office still sounded the same every morning. Keyboards tapping, coffee machines humming, quiet conversations drifting between desks. Meetings continued as usual. Projects moved forward, and Mark continued to behave exactly the way he always had. Confident, relaxed, comfortable guiding conversations. If anything, the rhythm of our interactions became even smoother. But internally, something had shifted in the way I approached those moments. Before, my silence had been passive. Now, it was deliberate. There's a difference between someone who stays quiet because they feel dismissed, and someone who stays quiet because they're observing something unfold. Once that distinction became clear in my mind, meetings started to feel different, not tense, just informative. For example, a week later, we had another project review meeting in the same glass conference room. Mark was presenting an updated rollout timeline. He spoke with the same easy authority he always had, explaining how the team had simplified a few unnecessary compliance checkpoints to keep the project moving efficiently. No one questioned it. The room nodded along. At one point, he glanced in my direction with a half smile. "Henry will make sure we're technically covered on the paperwork side," he said. The comment sounded supportive, but it carried the same underlying assumption that had been forming for months. That compliance was something flexible, something that could quietly adjust itself after decisions were already made. A few people looked toward me briefly, waiting for confirmation. I nodded once and said calmly, "I'll review the documentation." That was it. No correction, no explanation. The meeting moved on immediately. From their perspective, it probably looked like an agreement. From my perspective, it was simply an observation. Over the next few weeks, moments like that continued. Small edits to documentation, casual remarks during meetings about keeping compliance simple, assumptions that I would smooth out any technical requirements quietly behind the scenes. And every time those moments appeared, I responded the same way. Calm acknowledgement, minimal reaction. Continued documentation. Meanwhile, my notebook was filled with small entries, dates, meeting summaries, decisions that were spoken aloud, but never written into official project notes. Again, none of this was unusual for my role. Compliance professionals document things constantly, but there was one subtle difference now. Before, those notes were simply part of my workflow. Now, I paid closer attention to how those notes aligned with the official documentation being shared across teams. Sometimes, the two matched perfectly. Other times, there were small gaps, statements made confidently in meetings that didn't appear in the written record later. Decisions that were summarized differently, depending on who was presenting them. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of quiet inconsistencies that happen naturally when multiple people are involved in a project. Still, those inconsistencies had a pattern, and the more I watched that pattern unfold, the more something interesting became clear. Mark believed he understood the dynamics of the room. He knew how to guide conversations, how to simplify complicated issues so they sound manageable, how to keep the momentum moving forward. In many ways, those were valuable leadership skills, but there was one thing he seemed completely unconcerned about: records. He treated meetings as temporary moments, conversations that ended when people left the room. But in environments where compliance and documentation exist, conversations rarely disappear completely. They leave traces, notes, files, sometimes even recordings. Most people in that office didn't think about those traces very often. Mark certainly didn't. And the more confident he became in how the room responded to him, the less attention he paid to what might exist quietly outside the conversation, which meant something important was slowly happening without anyone realizing it. My silence was no longer just part of my personality. It had become a position, a place where I could watch how decisions were made, how they were documented, and how those two things sometimes drifted apart. And when that kind of gap appears inside an organization, it doesn't always stay invisible forever. Sometimes it waits patiently, until the moment someone decides to rely on a version of the story that isn't actually supported by the record. By early winter, the pattern had become almost routine. Meetings followed the same rhythm. Mark guided conversations. People trusted his summaries, and I quietly documented the details. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing had changed. But behind that familiar routine, something subtle had begun taking shape. Not conflict, preparation. The interesting thing about working in compliance is that you develop a particular relationship with information. Most people treat conversations as the primary source of truth in a workplace. Compliance professionals know better. In regulated environments, what matters isn't what people remember saying. What matters is what can be verified later. Documentation, email trails, version histories, meeting notes, these things form the quiet skeleton of how organizations protect themselves. Most employees rarely think about them unless something goes wrong, which is exactly why I started paying closer attention to how those records were being created. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't challenge Mark in meetings. I didn't send warning emails or escalate concerns. Instead, I simply became more thorough in the areas that already fell under my responsibility. After meetings, I made sure summaries were accurate, not confrontational, just precise. If a compliance checkpoint had been discussed but deferred, I noted it clearly. If a risk had been mentioned and someone suggested bypassing it temporarily, I documented the context. Again, nothing unusual, just careful documentation. But there was one detail most people never noticed about the conference rooms we used. Several of them had automatic recording systems enabled. They weren't secret recordings. The system was part of the company's meeting infrastructure, designed primarily for teams who needed transcripts or who had remote participants joining later. A small indicator light would appear when the system was active, but most people stopped noticing it after a while. It blended into the background like the hum of the air conditioning. For months, those recordings simply existed in the archive system, rarely accessed, and until recently, I hadn't paid them much attention either. But once I started comparing meeting summaries with the official project documentation, a quiet question appeared in my mind. What would the recordings show? So one evening, after most of the office had left, I opened the archive portal. It wasn't complicated to access. As part of compliance oversight, I had permission to review internal documentation systems, including archived meeting materials when necessary. I searched for a meeting from about 3 weeks earlier, the same meeting where Mark had joked about the extended director's cut while I was explaining a compliance requirement. The video loaded slowly. A familiar scene appeared. The glass conference room, 6 people around the table, laptops open, coffee cups were scattered across the surface. The camera angle was wide enough to capture everyone. For a moment, I just watched, not because I expected anything dramatic, mostly because I wanted to confirm something simple. How closely did the written meeting summary match the actual conversation? The answer was mostly accurate, but not entirely. When the moment arrived, when Mark interrupted my explanation, the tone of the room was clearer than I remembered. Not hostile, but dismissive in a way that the written notes couldn't fully capture. The laughter, the shift in body language. The conversation moved forward without finishing the explanation. None of that appeared in the official meeting summary, because summaries rarely capture tone. They capture decisions, and decisions are usually presented in their cleanest form. Still, watching that recording confirmed something important. The archive wasn't just storing transcripts, it was storing context. The room, the interruptions, the exact sequence of what had been said. I closed the video and leaned back in my chair. Again, I didn't feel anger. If anything, I felt a quiet sense of clarity, because the recordings weren't evidence of wrongdoing. They were simply records of how conversations actually happened. But suddenly, something about Mark's confidence in meetings made more sense. He believed the room defined reality. If he summarized a discussion in a certain way, that version became the official understanding. Most of the time, that assumption was true. People trusted the person leading the conversation, and few people ever revisited the raw record afterward. But the record existed, quietly, patiently. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. If a disagreement about those conversations ever arose, if someone confidently described a meeting in a way that didn't match what actually happened, there would be a way to verify it. At that moment, I still didn't expect anything like that to occur, but the awareness stayed with me, because sometimes the most powerful leverage in an organization isn't authority, it's accuracy. And accuracy becomes very difficult to challenge when the entire conversation has been preserved exactly as it happened, something Mark, and most of the room, had never once considered. The realization didn't arrive with excitement. There was no sense of triumph, no moment where I leaned back in my chair, thinking I had discovered something powerful. If anything, the feeling was quieter than that. Clarity tends to feel calm. Over the next few weeks, I occasionally revisited the meeting archive system, not obsessively, just when I needed to verify details, while preparing compliance summaries. Each time, the same pattern appeared. The recordings simply showed the meetings as they actually were. Conversations are unfolding naturally, ideas forming in real time, interruptions, clarifications, jokes, nothing dramatic, but the recordings preserve something that written summaries often smoothed over: the precise order of events. Who spoke first? Who interrupted? What questions were asked before a decision was made? And sometimes, concerns that had been raised before being dismissed. Again, none of this felt like a discovery of wrongdoing. It was simply the unfiltered version of how meetings happened. But one afternoon, while reviewing a recording from a recent planning session, I noticed something that made me pause. It was another discussion about compliance requirements. Mark was explaining to the team how the documentation had already been handled and that there were no remaining obstacles to the rollout. As he spoke, the others nodded. The room moved quickly through the agenda, but earlier in that same meeting, about 15 minutes before that statement, I had raised a question about a regulatory verification step that still required documentation. The video showed it clearly. I had spoken. Mark had responded quickly, summarizing the issue in a simpler way, and assuring the room that it wouldn't delay anything. Then the conversation had moved on. Watching the recording back, I realized something subtle. The version of the conversation people remembered was the one Mark had summarized, not the one that had actually occurred. This wasn't deception. It was something more common than that. Narrative compression. When someone is confident and reframes a discussion quickly enough, the room often accepts that version as the official understanding. Most of the time, that works fine. Teams need momentum. Meetings can't dissect every detail endlessly, but in compliance work, those compressed narratives sometimes leave small gaps between what was discussed and what was documented afterward. And the archive system preserved those gaps perfectly, not as accusations, just as reality. I watched the rest of the recording quietly. No one looked uncomfortable. No one realized anything unusual had happened. To them, it was just another efficient meeting. When the video ended, I closed the archive window and sat for a moment. That's when the full picture finally settled into place. Mark believed he understood the dynamics of influence inside a meeting. He understood tone, confidence, momentum, but he had never once considered that the meeting itself might not be the final record of what happened. That somewhere else in the system, the original conversation remained untouched, not summarized, not interpreted, simply preserved. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel careful, because leverage like that isn't something you celebrate. It's something you handle responsibly. The recordings didn't exist to prove anyone wrong. They existed to protect the accuracy of the organization. Still, a quiet thought crossed my mind that afternoon. If a situation ever arose where someone confidently described a meeting in a way that didn't match what had actually happened, the truth wouldn't depend on memory or persuasion or office politics. It would already be sitting quietly in the archive, unedited, uninterpreted, waiting for someone to ask the right question. At that point, I still had no reason to believe that moment would ever come. Mark was confident, but not reckless. The team functioned well enough, and workplace misunderstandings usually resolve themselves before they become serious. So I closed the system, returned to my regular work, and continued documenting meetings the same way I always had, calmly, thoroughly, without drawing attention to it. But sometimes, the most important leverage in a situation appears long before anyone realizes it will be needed. And when that happens, the wisest thing you can do is exactly what I did. Nothing. Just continue observing, because when the moment finally arrives, preparation rarely needs to announce itself. It was just another meeting, same conference room, same glass walls, same quiet hum of laptops opening while people settled into their chairs. Mark was leading the discussion again, walking everyone through a revised rollout timeline. His tone was relaxed, confident, the way it always was when he felt in control of the conversation. Halfway through the meeting, I raised a simple clarification about one of the compliance checkpoints tied to the release. Nothing confrontational, just a question about whether the documentation has been updated since the last revision. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair, then he smiled. "Henry worries a lot about things that aren't really issues," he said casually to the room. A few people chuckled. Then he added something else. "Sometimes it feels like he's trying to slow projects down on purpose." The comment hung in the air for a second longer than usual. It was still delivered like a joke, but this time it carried a different weight. Because it wasn't just dismissing an idea, it was reframing my intent. I noticed a few glances around the table. People weren't laughing as easily this time. Still, no one challenged the statement. The meeting continued. Mark moved the agenda forward, and within a few minutes, the room had shifted to another topic. But something important had just happened. For months, the pattern had been subtle. Interruptions, jokes, casual dismissals. Now the narrative had taken a step further. Henry's description as overly detailed to Henry might be a problem. That distinction mattered, because once someone begins framing another coworker's behavior as obstructive, the story can grow quickly, not necessarily because people believe it immediately, but because uncertainty spreads faster than clarity. As the meeting ended, and people began gathering their things, I closed my notebook and stood up. And in that quiet moment, a decision settled in my mind. Not a reaction, a boundary. I wouldn't confront Mark in the hallway. I wouldn't send defensive emails. But if the story about my behavior ever moved beyond casual comments, if it ever became a formal claim about what had happened in one of those meetings, then the version of events people believed wouldn't depend on confidence. It would depend on the record. And the record, as I already knew, was very clear. After that meeting, I didn't change my routine. I still arrived at the office a little before 9. Still reviewed documentation before most of the team settled in. Still attended meetings with the same notebook and the same calm presence people were used to. From the outside, nothing about my behavior suggested anything had shifted. But internally, my approach had become more precise, not defensive, just careful. Whenever project updates were documented, I made sure the language reflected exactly what had been discussed. If a compliance checkpoint had been questioned or postponed, the notes captured that context clearly. No accusations, just accuracy. I also began organizing my records more methodically. Meeting summaries, version histories, archived recordings are tied to specific discussions. All of it already existed within the company's systems. My role simply involved making sure those materials were easy to reference if needed. Again, nothing unusual. Compliance work often requires that level of organization. Meanwhile, Mark continued operating exactly the way he always had, confident in meetings, quick with summaries, comfortable shaping the narrative of how discussions had unfolded. And because no one challenged him openly, the pattern remained intact. People trusted the version of events they heard most clearly in the room, which meant no one noticed the quiet difference between two things: what people believed had happened in meetings, and what the records actually showed. Weeks passed, projects moved forward, and gradually, the small tension introduced during that meeting faded into the background of everyday work. At least for everyone else, because by then, I understood something important. Most workplace conflicts escalate loudly, but the situations that truly matter usually develop in silence first. They grow slowly, unnoticed, until someone decides to turn a conversation into a formal statement. And if that moment ever arrived, Everything I had organized would already be waiting, not as ammunition, just as clarity. At first, nothing seemed different. The office moved through its usual rhythm. Meetings happened, deadlines approached, people focused on their own projects. But subtle changes began appearing in places most people wouldn't notice. A few weeks after that meeting, one of the project managers stopped by my desk. "Hey, Henry," she said, glancing at her laptop. "Can you double-check the compliance notes for the rollout?" Leadership asked for the documentation trail. That wasn't unusual. Executives often requested documentation when projects got closer to launch. So I pulled up the files and shared the records exactly as they existed. The meeting summaries, the version history, the compliance checkpoints that had been discussed earlier. Nothing dramatic, just the documented timeline. Later that afternoon, I noticed Mark walking past my desk more slowly than usual. He didn't say anything, but there was a slight tension in his expression, the kind people get when they realize something about a situation they hadn't fully considered before. Over the next few days, similar requests appeared. Another manager wanted clarification about an earlier meeting discussion. Someone from the legal team asked for confirmation of a specific compliance step. Each time I provided the same thing. The record, not my interpretation, not my opinion, just the documented sequence of what had happened. And slowly, something interesting began happening inside the team. People weren't upset. They weren't accusing anyone, but they were starting to notice that certain conversations they remembered didn't quite match the documentation trail as neatly as they thought. Questions appeared, quiet ones, the kind people ask when they're trying to understand how a project actually evolved over time. No one mentioned Mark directly, but the room began looking at the record more carefully. And when people start looking at records instead of assumptions, the tone of a workplace changes in ways that are difficult to reverse. The shift in the office didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, through small moments that most people might have overlooked. More questions began appearing during project reviews, not confrontational questions, just requests for clarification. Can we confirm when that compliance step was removed? Do we have the meeting notes from that discussion? Was that decision documented somewhere? Each time, the answer was the same. Yes, the records existed. Meeting summaries, document histories, archived recordings. Nothing had been hidden. But the more those materials were reviewed, the clearer something became. Certain decisions that people assumed had been unanimous hadn't actually been. Concerns that had been briefly raised in meetings had disappeared from later summaries, and some explanations that sounded confident when repeated later didn't quite match the original discussions. Again, no one accused anyone directly, but the room had changed. People spoke more carefully. Managers reviewed documentation more closely before approving the next steps. And Mark, for the first time since he joined the company, seemed noticeably quieter during meetings. Not defensive, just cautious. Because once a workplace begins relying on records instead of memory, it becomes very difficult to reshape the story afterward, and by the time that realization settles in, most of the important moments have already been preserved, exactly as they happened. The conversation happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. No audience, no raised voices. Mark stopped by my desk just after most of the team had stepped out for a late lunch. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, as if deciding how to start. "Henry," he said finally, "do you have a minute?" I nodded and closed my laptop. We moved to one of the smaller meeting rooms, the kind people usually used for quick check-ins. The glass walls made everything visible, but the room itself was silent. Mark leaned against the table. "I've been hearing that leadership has been reviewing a lot of old meeting documentation lately," he said. His tone wasn't aggressive, just controlled. "They've been asking questions about some of my project updates." I listened. Then I said, "They asked for the documentation trail. I provided it." Mark nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "You've been keeping very detailed records, haven't you?" "Yes," I said calmly. "That's part of compliance." Another pause. He looked toward the glass wall, thinking. "I didn't realize those meeting rooms recorded everything," he admitted quietly. I didn't respond immediately. Then I said something simple. "Most people don't think about it." Mark let out a slow breath. There was no argument after that, no accusations, just the quiet understanding that the version of events people believed and the version preserved in the record were now the same thing. And once that happens, there isn't much left to debate. Looking back, the situation never became dramatic. No one was fired, no public confrontation happened, and the office didn't erupt into conflict. Instead, the environment simply adjusted. Meetings became more careful, documentation became more thorough. People paused a little longer before summarizing what had been said. As for Mark, he remained at the company, but his approach in meetings changed noticeably. He listened more. He asked clarifying questions before moving conversations forward. The confident shortcuts he used to take when summarizing discussions slowly disappeared, not because anyone forced him to change, but because once the room understood that the record existed, the tone of the room naturally shifted. As for me, my role didn't change much on paper. I was still the quiet compliance analyst, still the person documenting discussions and reviewing processes. But something subtle had changed in how people saw that role. Before, compliance had been treated like background paperwork. Now it was recognized as something else, a memory for the organization, a way of preserving what actually happened when decisions were made. And personally, the experience reinforced something I had believed for a long time. Influence doesn't always come from speaking the loudest in a room. Sometimes it comes from understanding how the room works and making sure the truth is preserved after the conversation ends. I never needed to argue. I never needed to prove anyone wrong. All I needed to do was exactly what I had always done. Pay attention and write things down. If you take anything from this story, I hope it isn't the idea that someone won, because that's not really what happened. No one walked away humiliated. No one celebrated a downfall. What actually happened was quieter than that. A misunderstanding about power corrected itself. For a long time, the room believed confidence defined the truth. Whoever summarized the meeting most clearly controlled the narrative, and most of the time, that assumption works. Teams need people who can move discussions forward and keep momentum alive. But momentum without accuracy can become dangerous, especially in environments where decisions have consequences beyond the room. Compliance, documentation, and records exist for a reason. They protect organizations from memory because memory changes. People remember what they believe happened, what they wish had happened, or what someone confidently told them had happened. Records don't do that. They simply wait, patiently, for the moment when someone asks, "What actually happened?" That's the part of the story that stayed with me the most. Not Mark's confidence, not the jokes in meetings, but how easily a group can begin relying on the loudest voice instead of the clearest record, and how quickly that changes once the record becomes visible. Personally, the experience didn't make me louder. If anything, it made me more comfortable with the way I've always worked. Observing, documenting, letting the facts speak when they're needed, because quiet people are often misunderstood in workplaces. Silence gets mistaken for weakness. Patience gets mistaken for passivity. But sometimes silence is simply the decision to wait for the right moment, when the truth doesn't need to be argued anymore. It just needs to be shown, and that's why I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people underestimated you, simply because you didn't feel the need to prove yourself in the moment? I'd genuinely like to hear how you handled it.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.